vertically challenged. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to chat with you a little bit today. I'll be talking with you today about understanding some of the challenges of dyslexia and also how we can work to provide students with dyslexia access. That's a major focus of my work, is how do we provide diverse bodies of students with access to educational and other learning opportunities. Okay, so today's agenda, we're going to first figure out what everyone's connection is to dyslexia in the room, identify a common understanding of how dyslexia is defined, talk briefly about the prevalence of it, because perhaps some of you are new to this and maybe are yet to be teachers and don't quite know how often we might see this in our learning environments. We'll discuss some of the characteristics, and then how can we provide opportunities to access. So, as Dr. Craven introduced me, my name is Janet Josephson. I began my work in the field of education in September 2001 as a New York City public school teacher. In my 7 years as a New York City public school teacher, I worked as a music educator, a general educator, an adjunct instructor for various fast-track teacher prep programs, and finally I landed myself in the role of special educator, where I was most happy. I taught students in grades K to 8 across various levels of exceptionality, but my passion was always in advocacy and special education. While teaching, I completed 2 master's degrees, one with an emphasis on the Orton-Gillingham methodology, which you will learn about in your breakout sessions should you go to those. I was hooked at that point. In 2007, I made a move to Philadelphia area where I worked as a lead special education teacher for a charter school. My main responsibilities included training staff on evidence-based interventions and moving our students ahead, especially in the areas of literacy and mathematics. After a year in Philadelphia, I was recruited by a Center City school whose mission was serving all students within every zip code of Philadelphia using a Spanish immersion model. I introduced the Wilson language system to my upper elementary school students who were still struggling to read and saw great progress in them. It was at that time that I wondered, can I train teachers for a living? And well, here I am. I've been a member of the MU Department of Early, Middle, and Exceptional Education since 2014. I teach classes such as Introduction to Exceptionality, Formal Assessment, Classroom Assessment, and Collaboration and Consultation for the Special Educator, how to play nice. My hope for this session today is that it will help frame your purpose for attendance in today's conference. So to begin, I want to invite all of you to just, we're going to be spending a lot of time together today, so if you can perhaps find someone around you and just take a moment to introduce yourself to someone new, and if you're comfortable, explain maybe what is your connection to dyslexia, what brought you here today. I'll give you a moment just to chat for that. And now that you've all made a new friend, let's start to wind down. You'll have lots of time to talk with your new friends at lunch, throughout the day. Wonderful. Sometimes when I do that, the room stays quiet and I have to get down and pair people up. So, what is dyslexia? So just setting some ground here to make sure we're all on the same page. Well, there's a few myths about dyslexia. Before I tell you what it is, let me tell you what it isn't. It isn't someone being stubborn. It's not a sign of a lack of intelligence, nor is it the result of someone being lazy. But still, many educators, employers, parents, and other key influencers in our society think that these are the very characteristics of dyslexia. Dyslexia is not about seeing letters backwards on a page. It's not about a visual problem that can be corrected by wearing special contact lenses or using colored overlays, or by engaging someone in eye-tracking exercises to train their eye muscles. After I present several different definitions for dyslexia, we're going to look at some of the common characteristics and identify different ways for supporting individuals who display those characteristics. So back in 1987, Wagner and Torgerson published an article where they coined the term dyslexia, and they defined it as the following. Children with dyslexia have primary impairments in single word reading and underlying phonological processing deficits, an area composed of component skills of phonological awareness and recoding. So you're going to hear a lot today in some of the breakout sessions about phonological processing. I'm not going to get into that in this particular session, but that's definitely a term that you're going to hear over and over today. 20 years later, in 2007, Fletcher, Lyons, Fuchs, and Barnes said dyslexia has also been referred to as a word reading level disability. And most recently, the American Speech and Hearing Association said people with dyslexia have problems with reading. Many also have other language problems. Learning disabilities is considered the best term to use. So, as a professor here at Millersville, I teach according to federal law because I realize that so many of my students might become teachers in other states. So when I talk about dyslexia, I talk about it under the umbrella of language-based learning disabilities, because that's federally a definition that we all seem to agree upon. So it says specific learning disability means a disorder in one or more of the basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written, that may manifest itself in the imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, or to do mathematical calculations, including conditions such as perceptual abilities, brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, and developmental aphasia. So somewhere within all of that vocabulary, we find the word dyslexia, and if you didn't find it, I bolded it for you, okay? So it's not easy to find, but this is mentioned in section 300.8 of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So we can agree from all of these definitions that dyslexia affects predominantly reading, right? That's our main focus today. But reading doesn't just exist in a reading classroom, it exists in almost every facet of our lives. So I'm going to be previewing for you today 5 of the most current research articles from the last 2 years that have identified some critical factors that can help us support individuals with dyslexia with greater strength in our classrooms and learning environments. So how prevalent is dyslexia? So you were so good at chatting with your neighbor a moment ago. Let's see if you can come up with a couple of guesses here as to what percent of the, let's say the school-age population, since that's the data we can track, ages 3 to 21, what percent of the school-age population would you think might be individuals who have dyslexia? Just turn and talk to someone and exchange your magic number real quick. Okay. So, do we have anyone who thinks that they want to share their number? This is kind of where it becomes like an auction and you like hold up your paddle with your number. Yes, in the back. 20%. 20%, 20%. Do I hear 21, 21%, 21%? 20%. Any other guesses? 30%. 30. Do I hear 40? Okay. Anyone have some numbers that were significantly lower than that? A couple of you maybe? Okay. All right. Well, let's see what we know. Let's see what we can actually track on this. So, according to the National Center, now don't get excited, those of you who said 30%. According to the National Center for Educational Statistics, in the 2017-2018 school year, the number of students ages 3 to 21 who receive special education services under IDEA was 7 million, or roughly 14% of all students in our public schools. Of those 14% of all public school students receiving all special education services, approximately 34% of them were identified as having a specific learning disability. Of that, we can only project that there is a subgroup of individuals who have learning disabilities that are specific to word-level reading issues. So 30% was not a bad guess at all. We can certainly assume that it's somewhere that of that 34% of students with learning disabilities, a great number of those students likely have language-based learning disabilities. It really varies from state to state how we siphon that out, because specific learning disabilities is a broad umbrella that encompasses a lot of other areas of challenge for students. So let's put this into perspective in a typical size classroom. If you think about a typical classroom of 30 students, this translates to about 1.5 of every 30 students having a specific learning disability. Many of those may also have that dyslexia diagnosis. So what are some of the common characteristics? How might you notice dyslexia in a learner in your life? And when I say learner, I'm not necessarily referring to students. We're all learners in some way, always learning about something new. So individuals with dyslexia can display any of the following characteristics. But it's important to note that individuals with dyslexia have inter-individual differences. So what that means is no two individuals with dyslexia present themselves in the same way. However, there are several generalizable characteristics that are kind of the trademarks of dyslexia. These characteristics that you see in front of you have been developed by the International Dyslexia Association. They include things like difficulty learning to speak, learning letters and sounds, organizing written and spoken language, reading quickly enough to be able to understand what we're reading, persisting with and comprehending reading assignments, spelling, and learning foreign languages. Because private and parochial schools vary in their methods of screening, let me give you an overview of how public schools might go through a diagnosis for a specific learning disability. So this is more specific to the state of Pennsylvania's public school system and how it should happen. Upon noticing a sign of difficulty, a classroom teacher refers a student to the school's intervention process. This might be called the response to intervention model, response to intervention and instruction, multi-tiered system of support. We like to call it different names to keep you on the edge of your seat. Either way, it's designed to be a flexible and proactive means for providing prompt, research-based support to students who need it. If after 3 to 4 tiers of intervention, each tier lasting anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks or so, we see no signs of improvement, we should be obtaining family permission to conduct a formal evaluation to see if the student is eligible for a specialized instruction program known as an individualized education program. Now again, this is how the system is designed to work with such challenges. The reality, however, is that this isn't always how the system works, and you'll hear more about that in some of our other sessions. So now that we have a little bit of a common understanding of how often we might encounter a learner with dyslexia in our learning environments and some of the generalizable ways that we might recognize them, let's shift our focus to how we might be able to support those individuals. Rather than focus our attention on a list of simple accommodations that you can just look up on the internet yourself, I want to share some of the most current research on the topic. A major challenge in the field of education is making connections between the scientific work of education researchers and classroom practitioners. The research to practice gap in addressing the needs of students with disabilities is alarming, and it has a negative impact on all of our students. So study number 1, an article that was published last month in the Journal of Speech, Language, and Hearing Research indicated that kindergarten letter naming fluency assessments were a more accurate predictor of second grade dyslexia diagnoses than other phonological awareness measures. So if you're not familiar with this measure, it presents the student with a list of random letters, both uppercase and lowercase, and asks them within a minute to name as many of those letters as they can. That measure alone, given in kindergarten, was a better predictor of later dyslexia diagnoses than any other phonological measures given in kindergarten. The authors examined the relationship between phonological awareness, letter identification, and word reading in 2 groups of students. 187 students with a language delay that they were investigating, and 260 students with those who were typically developing in their language skills. They were tracked in their reading abilities all the way through second grade. The letter identification subtest score from the Woodcock Reading Mastery subtest was a more effective predictor of later dyslexia diagnoses than any of the syllable or phoneme deletion tasks that were administered. So that is important because that's a 1-minute test. And in 1 minute, we can track data for students that might allow us to sooner diagnose them, to put them on our radar as potentially being at risk for later dyslexia difficulties. In her 2019 article published in the Reading Journal, Johnson summarizes the evidence that supports multisensory approaches to reading instruction. Teachers often employ reading instruction practices that only attend to listening and seeing. Other senses aren't included in the traditional approach. By employing a reading program that integrates listening, speaking, reading, and writing, students with dyslexia experience activation of more parts of their brain. Simple classroom strategies like counting syllables, integration of auditory sorting activities, and clapping phonemes are examples of activities that could be integrated into assigned classroom curricula. Specific multisensory programs that have a strong research base include the Orton-Gillingham approach, the Lindemood phoneme sequencing program, and the Wilson language system. An article in 2018 was published in the Language, Speech, and Hearing Services in Schools Journal. The authors identified several ways in which educators can support the writing skills of students with dyslexia. Writing is a complex task. Text generation places demands on our working memory, being able to make a connection between what we're thinking and how to get it onto paper, as well as transcription, physically writing the words and monitoring our spelling, and executive functioning, planning out one's writing, self-monitoring, making sure that we're staying on topic. Several research-based strategies show promise for increasing the writing skills of students with dyslexia. These strategies include training in morphemes to aid in spelling multi-syllabic words, the use of spell check programs, and using high-quality dictation programs. The Self-Regulated Strategy Development, or SRSD, is a method that can improve students' skills in planning and organizing their writing while also reducing the load on their memory. The sentence combining strategy has been shown to have a positive effect on qualitative features of written sentences. I see some of you are writing down these. I'll give you all of the citations at the end, and if you want more information about any of these, feel free to see me. Just giving you an overview so that maybe something will spark your interest in determining the sessions that are most beneficial to you later today. So, what about reading aloud? In a recent study published in the Learning Disability Quarterly, Robinson and colleagues wanted to determine if oral reading or silent reading was more effective in high-level reading comprehension for 77 students with reading disabilities, which may also include those with dyslexia per the IDEA definition. Students ranging from grades 2 to 5 in the study were all diagnosed with a specific learning disability in the area of reading. Students were asked to read various grade-level Ames Web passages. Those are short 100 to 300 word passages. They were asked to read those passages both aloud and silently. Following the passage reading, they were given 1 minute to retell the story. Their retells, which by the way, the retell validity is not very high, so I'll just put that out there. The retells were scored based on the number of unique ideas that each student expressed. On average, students retold more of what they read aloud, by 23%, than from text read silently, at 20%. They also showed improvement in their comprehension from the beginning to the end of the school year, with an increase of nearly 10% more information understood. So that could be relatively significant as well for how we structure our learning environments. The last piece that I want to mention to you is about reconsidering the deficit model. So in their 2018 article in Language, Speech, and Hearing Services in Schools, Rappolt-Shulman and colleagues urged professionals to change their mindset from thinking about dyslexia from a deficit or disabling perspective, and instead shifting to a mindset of enabling. So what exactly does that mean? The neurodiversity view might be something that you've heard of. We're all uniquely different. We all have unique features and challenges that build us. It's a strength-based view of exceptionality that recognizes intra-individual differences. It highlights an individual's strengths while viewing that disability is just a little piece of your individual characteristics that make one unique. This doesn't mean that we ignore the challenges of individuals with dyslexia. That would be irresponsible. Instead, we look for ways to embrace neurodiversity to bring a greater sense of dignity to those students in need. Something you might hear about today is universal design for learning. This is a framework through which barriers are removed to ensure access to a more diverse group of learners. So if you were to do an internet search for universal design for learning cartoon, you might find a cartoon image of 3 young men watching a baseball game. And the old version of it was that you had a short-sized man, a medium-sized man, and a tall man. And the tall man was able to see over the fence without issue. The medium-sized man stood on 2 boxes to see over the fence to catch the baseball game. And the shortest man stood on 3 boxes to be able to see over the fence. Well, today we have a new image of that, and that's removing the fence altogether and creating it as a chain link fence that everyone can see through regardless of height. Universal design for learning looks at removing barriers just like that. So instead of having this wooden fence and having to give each student a different number of boxes to stand upon, thus making it somewhat unequal in how everyone is treated, let's just look at the systemic barrier of that fence, take it down, replace it with a fence that everyone can see through, and then their height differences are no longer an issue. So this is a perspective that we take in our programs here at Millersville in how we teach students who want to be teachers to look for barriers in the curriculum and how to break those down. The work of these authors highlights the existing research on strength-based approaches to learning. Results for individuals are promising as the strength-based approaches tended to produce higher levels of student self-development, motivation, and academic outcomes. When we think about the research on students in another population, those with gifts and talents, one of the first things that we've noticed is a lot of students who are gifted are also twice exceptional, meaning that they also have a disability. And when we work with these students from their strengths first, we're then able to address the disability secondary. So taking a strengths-based approach with students with dyslexia and identifying what they're strong at is kind of a pathway for then meeting their needs in other ways. So what we're saying here is not to focus just on their deficits, but also look for those strengths and start there. So several of today's sessions will directly align with the 5 opportunities that I've highlighted for providing greater educational access to students with dyslexia. I hope that you'll find today's program to quench your inquisitive palate, and I hope that you make some new connections today so that we can work together to continue to advocate for students with dyslexia in our learning environments. And with that, we have a bit of time before our next session, so I would be willing to take any questions that you might have thus far. Yes, right here.
The use of technology in reading and writing skills that are becoming somewhat non-existent?
So to rephrase the whole question, the question was from a parent, has there been any recent research on the sort of influence, and correct me if I'm not restating it correctly, the influence of technology use on students' ability to read and write? Are you talking specifically about the amount of screen time, or are you talking about assistive technology that's designed to support students in reading and writing?
I'm referring to the use of technology within the classroom as a, right now I have a senior who does very well with paper and pencil, but yet to submit homework via technology, we're consistently seeing no credit given.
Okay.
So
I can speak to a portion of that because I have lots of research interests in lots of different areas. Most recently, we have kind of an abundance of data that has come out that indicates that when students actually handwrite their notes, there's greater memory recall of what they've written. Now, the act of writing notes from a lecture-based session requires a lot of working memory, kind of a multitasking. You have to hear what's being said and then translate it into your own language and then put it on paper. Students who can effectively do that are able to withhold more information in memory and therefore perhaps be able to master that content with greater accuracy. I will say that there are some newer studies being done in terms of looking at the use of ebooks versus textbooks, and so looking at the method by which students access their content reading. This would be more specific to post-secondary environments and perhaps also high school environments. And that research is still pretty new because we don't have a lot of it's difficult to conduct research with children with exceptionalities because they're, one, children, and two, they have an exceptionality. So they're like a double whammy when it comes to getting approval to run a study. But there is some new research out in that area, and I'd be happy to talk with you at some point. We have a session today about assistive technology that can be used to support individuals, and we have a small assistive technology lab here on campus that has a number of tools to support students in environments so that they could perhaps attend a lecture and take notes at the same time with the help of a couple supportive aides. I hope that somewhat answered your question. Okay, great, sure. Yes, I see over here in a red shirt. We're running a microphone to you. We're running it.
Thank you. I'm a parent, so
Awesome, thanks.
my question has to do with the statistics we talked about earlier. So my understanding before coming here today was that dyslexia is prevalent between 15 to 20% of the population. And I think if I did some back of the envelope math, 1.5 kids in every 30 students is 5%. And I'm just assuming, and I want to see if this assumption is correct, is you're basing it off of kids who do have IEPs?
Yeah, so the data that I track is relevant to students in schools because that's the main focus of my work. So the data presented was the 3 to 21 population, individuals between the ages of 3 and 21.
Okay.
So the reality is what you're looking at might be a larger statistic because that's the overall population, but given what my background is and my focus, my statistics were taken from the National Center for Education Statistics, which is just that 3 to 1 population, or 3 to 21 population.
Got it. I know when we're advocating for just better education for our children, especially these types of children, we need to use a consistent percentage. Do you have a recommendation of a percentage we could use?
So that's a tough question for me, and I don't at this point. Again, because my focus is so much in that 3 to 21, but I see that, it doesn't go away, right? When you're 21, your dyslexia doesn't leave you, and that's a big focus in our programs here at Millersville, that we inform our students that just because, you were diagnosed with a disability and you learn to manage it and work with your challenges, it never truly goes away. So I don't know of an organization that is, it would probably be an organization like the International Dyslexia Association, but unfortunately, they're kind of a private organization that isn't always recognized by some of the more name brand organizations of disability as a whole. So we have to get those two to play nicely.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. Right here in the front, I see.
Thank you. I am a reading specialist and I train and work with a lot of new teachers. And I was wondering if Millersville, like pre-service teachers, are being exposed to all of this information.
If they have my class.
Is it a required class? Like, is it something
So-
that's part that everybody, or it is an
To
elective?
give a little background of what our programs look like at Millersville for pre-service teachers, all of our students take a Foundations of Reading course, which is a lot about the different theories of reading, because, we go from, we should do whole word language, whole language, and then we should go to a phonemic based, and then, so we like to change our mind a lot, so we spend quite a bit of time discussing that piece. From there, students are expected to take, they learn how to do things like read alouds, so those sort of whole class pieces. The more specific, how do I recognize a disability in the area of reading, comes in their diagnostic reading course here, where they learn how to do things like give a qualitative reading inventory or a basic reading inventory, how to keep a running record to look for the kinds of errors that a student is making. And then later they take an assessment course so that they can learn about the pre-referral process and how it should work in a school, so that they can take the data from their reading inventory and present it with confidence at a child study team meeting and push the student into an intervention plan. So they do get that content, and that's just our general education students. Our special education students have an even deeper focus, because a lot of them will end up working as alongside a reading specialist or a reading diagnostician. Sure. I see in the back. Yep, that's you. We'll run a mic to you.
am a parent. I am curious, you mentioned using the dyslexic child's strength to help them with their education. Is there a breakout session today that highlights that, or do you have some recommended research that as a parent I can help with that?
I feel like today that I saw a session about, let me see here. I saw something somewhere about breaking like the deficit model. Dr. Craven, do you know of a session that closely aligns with that today?
Thank you. Okay. Thank you.
So today in room 100 at 2 o'clock, there will be a session led by some students with dyslexia who can talk a little bit about their schooling experiences and how how their strengths were maybe addressed or perhaps not addressed in their schooling. Other questions? We have time for about one more. Oh, right here, okay.
You addressed the gap in between kind of university training and happening in school districts. And I trained a lot of teachers, and an alarming amount of them had no idea how to teach reading. So do you have, it's scary. So is there a group at the university level, or what is the movement happening to try to address the research gap to the practice gap in schools? And how do we get connected in kind of trying to support that as educators?
Sure. So there's a lot of research also that indicates that new teachers, and sometimes even experienced teachers, but especially novice teachers, the group with whom I work most closely, they tend to go back to their own apprenticeship of learning. So I'm going to teach in the ways that I was taught because it's comfortable to me, it comes naturally to me, and it's what I know. So in terms of how do we fix this, really I look at it as a huge responsibility of folks in faculty positions who can do this research, excuse me, who are teaching the reading methods in class, monitoring that students are using those research-based interventions and methods in a placement experience, but then not stopping there, actually following up and doing longitudinal studies with these new teachers through their first 3 to 5 years of teaching to make sure that they continually put into place those research-based strategies. We can say, you know, about the evils of popcorn reading and how it's so problematic to, without warning, call on students to read aloud in a classroom, but yet walk into almost any public school classroom or any school classroom, and at some point you'll catch popcorn reading happening, and it's because that teacher had to popcorn read as a student. They know that it may not be the best practice, but we sometimes hit that default button. So I think that there's a lot of room for us to not focus so much on interventions with children, but looking at interventions with teachers and helping teachers, and not just going in and collecting data, but actually going in and helping and serving as a consultant. That's one of the really great things about some of these multisensory methods that I mentioned that you'll have an opportunity to learn more about later. I was sent a coach to my school from an Orton-Gillingham program who worked with me weekly to make sure that I was planning appropriately, implementing the lessons appropriately, and if I didn't, she jumped in right away to correct me. It wasn't that I had to wait until I had done something wrong and hear about it afterwards in hindsight. It was immediate feedback, and I think we need to do more of that. My next project. I have time for one more question.
My journey with dyslexia began back in 1999. And at that time, we could not really get a whole lot of help locally. So I took a sabbatical because I was a teacher, and we brought our grandson to Tennessee. And interestingly enough, at that point, they were the only state in the union that mandated mainstreamed education for children with dyslexia. But what they did to identify the teachers that needed support was they used something that they called stranding. And what they did was they would take their students at the primary school level, which there was K through 3, and they would track those students, but they would keep reblending them. So your kindergarten students would go into different first grade teachers' classrooms, and they would look at the strengths and the weaknesses that those students then displayed. Then they would work backwards and go to the teachers, not in a punitive way. But when we could see that the students in your classroom were not picking up certain basic skills that were necessary for those students to succeed, we mentored those teachers then so that they got to a point that, now then I needed to come back to Pennsylvania because sabbatical time was over. But the reality was their outcomes long-term, because those students had great success at that primary school level, they really didn't have a whole lot of need for emotional support classrooms at the high school level. And so there are ways to do it practically, easily, and we don't even have to invent someone else's wheel. It's out there.
Do you have time to take a trip to Harrisburg with me later?
I sit on the state task force, and I do go to Harrisburg. The challenge that you get is the answer to everything is funding. And the reality is, if we're going to make a change in this particular arena, it must be legislatively. We need, like other states, to basically tell education that these children will be mainstreamed. And if you look at your Act 69 outcomes, your data-based outcomes that they have right now, if you just take Orton-Gillingham and you place it in a classroom, not as a special ed program, but as a reading methodology, every student in that classroom will be a better reader. So your outcomes across the board. And you are already putting, you are funding literacy programs. You are just not choosing literacy programs that are effective.
Absolutely.